back, AP. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the beginning of the French Revolution, right? Well, not even the beginning, really. We're kind of still setting that entire thing up, right? So we're basically talking about, like, the causes, the preamble, the intro, the opening act of the French Revolution, like all that stuff, right? So the big thing about it is we left off in class talking about the social class structure and the faltering ancient regime, right? The faltering ancient regime, or the social class system that's beginning to show its glaring weaknesses going into 1789 when this revolution actually kind of bang, blows up, right? So the big thing that we need to understand, though, as well, is I don't think I'll ever be able to make that noise again in a series or anything like that, but we left off talking specifically about the Second Estate, right? So we started talking about the ancient regime and or the entire old order of things that was going on in France, right? The estate system that they used, and how the First Estate was mostly the clergy as one of the wealthiest ones out of all three, and how they were taxed none nearly, nor like not at all, right? And they owned 10% of all the land in all of France, and that they were also church officials, and that it was really ridiculous that they had that much money. So we also talked a little bit about as well the Second Estate, and that's where we left off, right? We're talking about the 400,000 people that were known as the nobility. Now, if we do this really quick little bit of math, we can actually look into the entire understanding of how much of France is actually involved in these first two estates, right? So we know that about 100,000 people were actually in the First Estate, and about 400,000 people were actually in the Second Estate, which leaves the other, 24.5 million people outside of these two, right? Now, the thing we do already know about the Second Estate as well is that it's made up of two different types of nobility. We know it's made up of the sword nobility, which of course are your ones that have actually earned their rights through military service, and then we also know of the robe nobility, the ones that have actually purchased their rights inside of this actual like social class system. Now, going into it, though, another thing we know is that they're taxed super lightly, like very, very aggressively lightly. Many of the taxes that the nobility even has to pay is on things like salt and land, right? A very old tax. It's been on the books since the likes of Francis I and the Valois kings that came before him. Now, looking into this entire thing as well, they should have been paying way more taxes as well on things like their income and how much they were hoarding and all this other stuff. Something that we need to also understand that is in this process, even though they were taxed super lightly, they retained lordship. They charged fees from their old medieval rights. They carried weapons, and they were exempt from many other things like military service that they did not actually choose to serve, all right? And on top of everything else, they were allowed to collect taxes, okay? Now, this is an interesting little premise of the French societal structure going in to 1789 and how things operated, because the monarchs actually didn't have enough people in their bureaucratic system to go out and aggressively collect taxes. So they actually farmed it out to another group of people known as the Farmers General, which is actually a very large organization that employed nobles that actually would go out and then collect the taxes, right? Now, a very famous one of these Farmers General's members is somebody we talked about when the bell rang yesterday, none other than Antoine Lavoisier, the very, very famous scientist and chemist. Now, we don't know if he was any up to, or excuse me, let me rephrase. We don't know if Antoine Lavoisier was up to no good, but we do know that some of these nobles were up to no good as they would skim off of the top of these taxable systems, and they also chose when and when not to tax certain items, right? They taxed the ever-loving snot out of things like wheat and bread and barley, right? Things that are, of course, used to make the all-important bread staple that everybody needs to actually eat, because everybody at this time was very, very well known for eating this thing, especially if you were in the Third Estate or poorer or something like that. You ate this thing known as the 4-pound loaf, right? You buy a 4-pound loaf of bread that would actually get you through probably a week or so, you and your family, and it was a very dense bread, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is they would often tax this bread. They would tax the wheat that was involved with it, leading to price fluctuations all over France and creating a very unstable system, right? The Farmers General also taxed salt super aggressively because they knew everybody needed it. Now, they imposed their own taxes on different goods, and they also issued this thing called the corvée, right? And the corvée was a system where they actually could force, like, poor people to work on their lands, because if the actual crown wanted to build a road and that road was going to go nearby and or adjacent to their land, they would be like, well, I'm not going to build it. Let's just force the poor people to do it, right? So the corvée tax is a really, really big thing that they got to issue as well. So as we can tell, we got some pretty unfair things going on right now. But now let's get into our third estate, right? Our everybody else estate, right? And I don't care what y'all say or how cringy you think that is. It's going to work and you're never going to forget it. Watch. All right, so like now look, big thing about it though is when we're looking at the everybody else is in the third estate, all right? Now this makes up 98% of the population. 98%, and they only possess a small amount of the nation's wealth, right? Most of the nation's wealth is actually retained and being hoarded in the top two estates, but the thing that's really messed up is they paid anywhere from 96 to 99% of the taxes in a fiscal year, okay? Now, how is this fair? Like, how is this fair in and of itself in the least, that the poorest population is paying the bulk of the tax burden. Well, a lot of it actually goes back to the Valois and the Bourbon Kings and things like that, and these old feudal rights that actually were given to people of the second and first estate. They were given these old feudal rights an exemption from taxation. That was the whole motivation, to buy your way into the nobility or to become a rogue noble if you so chose, right? Because literally, if you had the money and assets to move from the bourgeois class up into the rogue nobility and purchase yourself a nice little stake in the nobility, half the reason why you did it is because you got feudal rights and you got title and land, and you didn't have to pay taxes, right? Now, the problem is, though, is that this system must be changed, and the Enlightenment is beginning to shine glaring inadequacies on this tax burden, and also it's being exacerbated by the amount of debt that France is in. But inside this third estate, before I get a little bit too ahead of myself, because I know way too much about the French Revolution, and if any of you are ever really actually concerned about the French Revolution, you want to read a 1,000-page book about it by Simon Schama called Citizens, I highly recommend it. It's where I learned most of the stuff that I know about the French Revolution, right? But going into it, though, we need to understand that there are actually three groups within the Third Estate, right? The Third Estate is so large, I mean, y'all, it brings up 98% of the French population, right? If it's making up 98% of the French population, then it must actually contain large numbers in different groups of people, right? So the three different types of people that exist inside of the actual Third Estate are none other than the bourgeois, aka the wealthy third class, or the wealthy middle class, the wealthy members of the Third Estate. They're your lawyers, your business owners, your proto-factory owners, your, your higher-end, higher-educated, now rising up the ranks gentry of France. They're the ones who are participating heavily in the consumer revolution. They're buying certain goods. They're making money off the putting out system, right? They are the ones who are actually driving the economy within the Third Estate. Now, the interesting thing about it is they're also the educated ones, right? They're the educated ones that are going to heavily advocate for the Third Estate, and they're to advocate for them in things being changed, things becoming fairer, and things actually being better for the French people themselves, right? The bourgeois are the ones hearing about all these Enlightenment ideas in coffee houses and taverns and things like that, hearing about the things coming out of the salons, and maybe some of them even participating in the salons themselves, right? Now, the other big one, though, is the peasantry, right? When I say peasantry, I mean the rural peasants, right? The ones who live outside of the cities, right? Who live in the areas where they farm. Maybe they work on a post-agricultural revolution style farm that is beginning to be enclosed. Maybe they actually own a small plot of land on their own, right? Now, an interesting thing about this as well is that that is the bulk of the Third Estate. The bulk of the Third Estate is these rural peasants right here, who are day laborers, workers on farms, and kind of like a step above serf, right? Now, some of them themselves are even actually serfs still to that day. They have signed different contracts with nobles, and they live on that land, and they farm that land for the nobles themselves, right? Now, the interesting other one, the last group, is none other than our urban workers, right? Our population that's been on the rise quite a bit, right? Because post-agricultural revolution, you're going to see a heavy influx of people inside of cities, right? So these urban workers include people like printers, the workers in early factories, workers on docks and boats and things like that, canal workers, as well as some manufacturing workers, and then also the unemployed, right? The unemployed also get lumped in to the urban workers as well, but they're basically city dwellers that don't have much money and that actually make up the lowest and probably, you would say probably, or argue probably, the most financially unable to meet the demands of the growing debt of the French society, right? But those are our urban workers, okay? Now, the basic belief, okay, the Starbucks belief of the French Revolution really comes into play when you're talking about the Third Estate, right? So when you're talking about the Third Estate, a lot of textbooks, a lot of high school textbooks, a lot of kind of thinner things that you actually look into or read will tell you a very, very basic, white chocolate mocha frappuccino level of the French Revolution. And I'm not here to do that because that's trash. But the basic belief is that basically going into it is that there were really, really intense tensions between the wealthy bourgeois and the old nobility in the First Estate, right? That it was the Third Estate versus like the other two. That it was the Third Estate being led by the bourgeois, the educated post-Enlightenment class of gentry that's participating in that consumer revolution, getting mad at the nobles and mad at the clergy of the First Estate, and they're going against them, and they want to start and create a revolution to change things. Well, the thing about it that we've learned over time is that's not true, pretty much at all. That revisionism is actually showing us a little bit of a different perspective. Now, revisionism is sometimes considered a dirty word by people in society because people don't like the idea of revising history, right? But what actually we have noticed since the 1960s and 70s, due to very much so in-depth research research into Arthur Taylor's books and then also Simon Schama's work as well, revisionism is demonstrating to us that it actually doesn't have to do with the third estate versus the other two starting the revolution. That research shows that the nobility and even the bourgeois themselves, members of the third estate, were highly fragmented and internally full of rivalries, and that it wasn't as simple as the third estate versus everybody else, that it actually much more lines up with the idea of two things fighting against each other. You've got progressivism on one hand, which you should write that down, right? Progressivism, or the idea of changing society for the betterment of the people, a very Enlightenment style idea. And then you also have conservatism, right? The idea that people don't want to change, right? That the first and second estate does have members in it that want to keep their feudal rights, that want to keep their land rights, that want to keep things the way they were. And they don't want the things that go towards the Enlightenment because it scares them, freaks them out, and will hurt their status, right? So now going into it though, you've got the progressives and then the conservatives at this point that are going to start heading up against each other, all right? So that's the actual big ideological cause between all of these different estates. And you have to understand that a bunch of the nobles and a bunch of the clergy actually supported the third estate and thought things were really screwed up and were begging for actions from the monarchs. Now, speaking of the monarchs themselves, we're now also talking about the eroded power of those monarchs, right? And when we're talking about now, this terminology right here is something that I like to use. I kind of created this on my own, like the eroded power of the monarchs, because as we know in France, especially in 1700s France, monarch and monarchical power was really set forward by none other than your guy, King Louis XIV, but old bull's dead now, right? So like when we're looking at Louis XIV, he was your absolutist monarch that ruled over all of France, completely just did whatever he wanted to do, decided what he wanted to do, built the Palace of Versailles to get away from those scummy nobles in Paris, following those things known as the Fronde rebellions, right? The thing about it, though, is that after the wars of Spanish succession in 1714, Louis is going to be dead. Louis dies at a very, very old age in his 70s, and he actually dies, and what ends up occurring once he dies is his young grandson takes over, a man by the name of Louis XV. Now, I say man, and I use that word kind of in a little bit of a loose sense, because this is about how big he was whenever he actually takes the throne. He would have only been in his early single digits of years, around the age of 6 or 7, right? Now, this young man, though, is actually currently standing across the aisle from none other than Peter the Great. That is Peter the Great when he actually came to visit France, and he actually meets the young King Louis XV, the grandson of Louis XIV, right? Well, the thing about it that you have to understand, though, as well, is that every time Louis XIV or 15th would actually try to use a war to fix the debt that they were actually occurring, or actually try to grow their power and influence, this entire snowball starts rolling because of none other than Louis XIV and the War of Spanish Succession. So we need to understand that as they were trying to grow that power and influence, by the way, if it bothers you a little bit that these things are a little out of order, they are out of order. They're actually in reverse order. It actually goes Dutch War, Spanish Succession, Austrian Succession, but whatever. So the thing about it, though, is Louis XIV and Louis XV would fight several wars trying to grow France's dominance and their actual power structure within the rest of Europe. But they kept losing, right? So, for example, Austrian Succession was a tie all the same, so they didn't really make any money there. The War of Spanish Succession, all of Europe basically allied against Louis XIV and crushed him in war as well. And then also there was the Dutch Wars as well against the, because during the Anglo-Dutch Wars when, England was actually fighting against the Dutch, Louis XIV, as we know, actually sided with Charles II, gave him a royal allowance. Well, going into it, though, the problem was that these wars are going to incur massive amounts of debt. They're going to start a fiscal and financial crisis that France is going to have a really hard time handling. Well, after Louis XIV had died and they had a young Louis XV on the throne, this old organization began to rise up like a phoenix from the ashes and then reestablish their dominance and power, and they were known as none other than the Parlements, right? The Parlements came back a little bit, and the nobles that worked within the Parlements began to exert their authority and began to stifle and destroy any requests on new taxes that came through, because Louis XV actually proposed several new taxes to try and fix the debt that was going to be going down in France, but many of the Parlements wanted to retain that old nobility status, that old nobility power, and that old nobility privilege of not having to pay them, right? So the 7 Years' War, though, was the all-in motion by Louis XV, right? Louis XV at this point is going to be about yay age when he actually enters in to the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War during the 1740s and 50s. And when this entire war actually goes down, he goes all in. He's like, all right, here's all my chips. I'm all in. and they lost, right? Like, so they end up losing against the British and lose all of their territory in the Americas, including the Louisiana territory, which actually was a little bit more of a financial burden than anything else. But still, going into it, they actually lost the Louisiana territory, had to give it up to Spain, and they are only going to retain one colony, that being of Saint Domingue, right? Like, so Saint Domingue, also known as Haiti in the modern era, which will be a little bit of a purse, like, well, not a lightener, but a purse filler, but not enough, right? And so the 7 Years' War will lead to even more debt, of which they lost, and then literally by 1770, the financial crisis is getting so bad that Louis XV re-exerts absolute authority over the parlements and over the people of France. Now, what is occurring in this moment is a fancy little term that actually a lot of different writers like to talk about in historical senses, known as desacralization, right? Now, desacralization means that we are beginning to look upon our monarchs as inept rulers rather than people appointed by God, right? Louis XIV had an advantage over Louis XV, and it's the fact that he invoked that divine right rulership, that idea that he believed that he was selected by God himself to rule over the people of France and to guide them in the proper direction, right? Well, because of these failed wars, the loss of the War of the Spanish Succession, the tie that occurred in the Austrian Succession, the Dutch Wars, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and the constant losing, a lot of these different French members of society, especially the nobles, are beginning to look at their monarch and be like, you don't seem too God-appointed when you keep losing all this stuff. So it's leading to an erosion of the power of the monarchs. You see what I'm talking about there? What's occurring here is that they're beginning to lose, and they're losing a lot of money, and it's leading to a loss of their presumed power, right? Now, the thing about it that does end up happening, though, in 1774 is going to actually be, of course, the death of Louis XV. Louis XV dies at the age of 64 in 1774, right? And when he dies in 1774, his young 20-year-old grandson is going to be the guy that takes over, right? At the age of 64, which is actually pretty early for the king, but I will tell you this, it's a little early for the king, but it's not very early for Louis XV to die, because he partied a lot. Like, he was a very, very big fan of libertinism. He was very, very all over the place, partied constantly in Versailles and stuff like that, and so maybe his lifestyle actually led to his, like, slightly earlier death than some other kings that came before him. But he dies, his son's dead, and the only person that's actually in line to take the throne is his young, very, very soft, borderline inept grandson, who will become Louis XVI, traditionally known also as Louis Auguste, right? Louis Auguste was not even supposed to take the throne. It was supposed to be his older brother, but his older brother, the other Louis that they named as well, was, I cannot remember what his middle name was, because they actually named all these like future kings Louis anyway. They'd be like, oh, this is Louis blank, and this is Louis whatever, and then this is Louis Auguste, right? Well, Louis's older brother was supposed to take the throne, but he died from either some kind of fever or typhus or tuberculosis when they were both young, and it's going to pass over to Louis XVI, right? And Louis Auguste, or aka now Louis XVI, takes over when he's about 20 years old. And he's married. He doesn't have any kids yet, though, because he doesn't actually know what's going on, but we'll talk about that in class and stuff like that. He doesn't have any kids yet with his very, very beautiful wife, his Austrian wife, his wife known as Marie Antoinette, which is really, really sad and unfortunate, because literally, she was brought over to, France from Austria. Not even a real name either. She was actually Maria Antonio, and they forced her to change her name. We'll talk about that, though, in class a little bit as well, and how they made her give up her dog. Poor Mops. Now, going into it, though, as well, though, Louis XVI was very, very soft. He was super inept. He didn't really connect with people on a personal level. To give you, some understanding, when he was a child, he actually played with children who were much younger than he was. He had a hard time talking about politics with anyone who weren't direct advisors of his. He didn't really connect with the people of France. He got made fun of quite a bit, and a lot of people actually made fun of his inability to have kids and stuff. And so what ends up going down, though, when he actually comes to the throne, everybody starts not even yet. So when he was a kid, he had a favorite toy. His favorite toy was playing with locks, locks on the door. He was obsessing with it. He locksmithing. It carried all the way over into his adult life, and he loved locksmithing. I don't know, he's an odd bird, right? But the thing about it, though, is he's a little too soft. He's not aggressive enough, and the damage has really already been done. So these monarchs are coming into a terrible situation, right? A terrible situation where they're getting also a lot of negative press, right? Now, the thing you need to understand is that Louis XVI is coming into a bad situation because there's a lot of illegal literature by this point running around the city of Paris. This illegal literature would come in the form of pamphlets or circulars or flyers or little free pieces of paper or things that you could buy on the street in Paris that would just viciously make fun of the royals rebels and things like that. But nobody else was subject to more rumors and more negative press than this lady right here. Marie Antoinette was viciously ripped apart by a lot of the illegal press that's running around all over the streets of Paris. They called her a harpy. They said that she cheated on her husband all the time. They made pamphlets saying that she was hooking up with the Marquis de Lafayette. They did all this other crazy stuff. They literally said that she was a mythical beast brought here to destroy France from the inside out, right? So as you can see, the monarchs are not going to be looked upon very kindly by the people of France anymore, and this desacralization process is beginning to root itself into the society of France, right? Now, if you actually read a lot of different stuff about the growth of Louis XVI, he made a really big effort to try and actually create a very big connection with the people a little bit later on, and it worked for a little bit, but then it actually thins out and leads to his ultimate downfall, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, we're going to take two of those big five, causes, we're going to mush them together, right? And the American Revolution and the Enlightenment, we're going to take and we're going to put them together, right? Well, the thing about it that you need to understand is that there are huge impacts, both practical and ideological, when it comes to the American Revolution and the Enlightenment, okay? When we talk about the American Revolution and the Enlightenment being causes of the French Revolution, the practical reason why it's going to have a massive impact is going to have to do with the fact that it's going to lead to France into even more debt, right? Because France is going to heavily invest in the American Revolution and finance a large amount of it, and it's going to leave the crown bankrupt. Now, the thing about it that some of you are probably like, well, why would they even do that then? Why did Louis XVI, right? Louis XVI, this new kind of very young, fresh on the streets, soft king, why would he invest in the American Revolution if not only just to beat Britain? Well, the thing about it was there were trade implications as well. Like if we can become the exclusive financier and buyer of things like American cotton, American tobacco, and things like that, if they beat the British, well, this will be a really big deal. It'll reinvigorate the French economy. But the problem is, y'all, is that the second that America is done with their revolution, it's 1783. And the damage is so ingrained and done, it's going to take a long time for America to create a currency, to create a bank, a national bank, a government, on all this other stuff, and to actually get on their own 2 feet. So it just wasn't quick enough, and it was a bad investment, right? Now, that's the practical reason why this happened. But the ideological reason why it's going to help lead to the beginning of the French Revolution is because the people of France thought that the Americans were just the most BA people around. They were like, oh my God, the Americans lashed out against their government. They used Enlightenment ideas to basically look at their government and be like, screw you guys, we won't do it. And then rebelled and created a new system all their own, right? That represented those Enlightenment ideals in action. And nobody, I repeat, nobody gravitated towards the American revolutionary cause like this man did, right? That right there is none other than Gilbert, the Marquis de Lafayette, right? The Marquis de Lafayette, the same guy that Lafayette, the city, is actually named after, was a heavy supporter of the American Revolution. Interesting fact, though, he's also a noble. He's a member of the Second Estate. He's a sword noble member of the Second Estate, and he actually joined the American Revolutionary cause and fought in the American Revolution alongside of George Washington himself, even getting injured in battle and shot in the leg, right? And if we actually look very closely at his garb and his attire, look at that bad boy right there. That's none other than one of those tricolor pins that people would wear when they show that they supported a revolution in France, right? But Gilbert de Lafayette represents the ideological and practical reasons of the actual American Revolution itself. And he's going to be an important player in this entire process as we go forward, because literally he actively participates and supports the revolution when it breaks out. Now, the American Revolution, though, also represents the Enlightenment ideals in action because it represents the concepts of life, liberty, and natural rights that are actually put out there by John Locke. And John Locke himself said that if your government does not defend the ideas of your people, then they have to be overthrown by those people, right? That's your social contract right there. The other big one as well is that it's going to actually mirror the ideas of Voltaire, right? It's going to mirror the ideas of Voltaire and the ideas of that you will not directly tax people. You will not directly be a fanatic about things. You will not invest so much in the British economy over the Americans who are 2,000 miles away, right? You will also, the other big one that it represents is none other than Baron de Montesquieu, right? Baron de Montesquieu is a heavily enforced member of the Enlightenment on the American Revolution because literally the government the Americans create is the three-branch government system of separated powers that Montesquieu himself came up with, right? So that right there, if it's not one of the biggest causes, might be like the second/third most important cause of the entire thing. But this one is probably the biggest one, right? The biggest cause of the French Revolution has to be the fact that they just had no money. They were just broke, right? A financial crisis is sweeping through France during the 1780s that is crushing their ability to get out of debt and to reconvince some of that debt as well, right? And attempts to fix this issue of financial crisis all failed miserably in the process. They had multiple different finance ministers come in and be hired by the crown to try and fix these different elements of financial crisis. But let's talk about this financial crisis a little bit and where some of this money is going. Because they're still taxing people, right? They're still taxing people, but where is the tax money of the French people going? Well, 50% of the yearly taxes that are actually being collected by the French people, or excuse me, by the French nobles and stuff like that, y'all, this is a staggering statistic that shows you exactly how bad the financial situation was in France leading into their revolution. The thing about it is that 50%, aka half of all of the money that was collected in taxes in France in the 1780s was paying just the interest on the debts they owed to other countries, right? That's bananas. All right, so now a lot of y'all don't understand how interest works and stuff like that, and we'll talk about that a little bit in class just to get y'all to understand better that if you're only paying the interest on credit or debt, I hope a lot of y'all are paying attention to what this means, because I also hope that a parent is listening to this right now, listening to me trying to actually explain interest on loans to kids and be like, yes, it's important. Listen to Mr. Terry right now. For example, if you had a credit card and you owed $500 on that credit card, but you're only paying the interest charge to that debt amount every single day or every single month, that means you're not paying off the credit card at all. You're only paying the credit card company for the ability to have the money, period, right? So 50% of the French tax money is paying just the interest on their loans, right? The other 25% or another 25% is directly going to fund the military, right? They're funding the military and the military actions and the military needs following all of these wars. Now, 6% of that is also going strictly to the crown, right? Like strictly to the royals, their like servants, the people that work for them and stuff like that, which if you took 6% of the tax money raised by the United States of America every single year, y'all, it'd be worth $440 billion a year, right? So 6% of their money is also going to just keep Versailles up to date, right? To keep paying the servants and the workers and the nobles who live in that palace with the royals, right? So the other thing about it, that leaves a meager 19% of the tax money for everything else, which is going to be impossible to fund an entire country on, right? So they are really bad off, like really, really bad off. And now speaking of some of these attempts to fix these issues that fail miserably, they fail so bad because they are not only facing that financial crisis right there, but they're also facing problems of famine and bad harvest, right? Several different years in a row, they were having a really, really terrible weather and environmental issues in France that were leading to low outputs of wheat and barley, leading to the fluctuation in prices of that all-important 4-pound loaf of bread, right? So since you have poorer harvest, it's going to drive the price up because it's making the entire wheat that's used for them less and less in supply, right? And so since we have less supply, the demand is high, so it's going to actually lead to the fluctuation of that price going from a usual 3 livres, 4 livres is actually the name of their dollars at the time, about 3 livres, it's going to drive it as high in some areas of France as high as 16, which is what a person would make in a week, right? So you made that in a week, and you can only buy bread with it, right? So bad harvests are crushing things, and also the canals outside of Paris and the canals and the shipping areas were staying frozen for longer because they were having a really, really bad spell of cold winters. And then also you've got inflation. The prices of things are going up, but people's money is not rising, right? And you also have a bread crisis that's occurring because since they're not having as much wheat, since they're not creating as much barley, they're having to cut the bread with stuff, right? To try and make it so they could actually make more of it and make enough of it to give to people to survive. They had to cut it with other things to try and thin the wheat out a little bit. And one of the things they would oftentimes cut with it, this stuff is also called black bread usually, what they would cut with it is sawdust. They would literally take sawdust from trees and throw it into the dough and they would make bread out of it. and that's not good for you, right? Like, so like cellulose and things like that from plant matter is not good for you when it actually is coming from trees and wooded material. Now, like all these things go together to make a crisis that's very real, right? And by 1787, things are getting so bad that they are beginning to call advisory boards, right? Now, an advisory board is a group of like notable individuals that go off and talk to like the king to try and figure out a way to how are we going to fix this whole thing, right? Well, a lot of y'all are probably sitting back right now watching this flip going like, well, Mr. Terry, wouldn't it be way easier if they just taxed the first and second estate aggressively, right? Like if they just tax them more, they have a lot of money. So if they just tax them more, could they reconvince a lot of this debt or enough to just stay alive, right? And you're right, they could do that, right? Well, the thing about it though is the earliest attempts to trying to get those nobles and those like church officials to actually agree to this is going to fail really, really bad. They kept hiring one finance minister after another, all right? So like you got guys like Jacques Turgot, you got Brienne, you got Cologne, you got Necker and stuff like that. And we'll talk about him in about 2 seconds. So looking at these different ministers, this guy right here, that's Brienne, right? Brienne comes in and he is aggressive. He's like, we need to increase taxation. We also need to let the market like fluctuate on its own. We need to also, then Cologne comes in and says the same exact thing. But Cologne, that guy right over here, who is actually really, really close friends with Marie Antoinette, so like actually comes in and says, we need to call an assembly, right? We need to call a meeting of notable figures, right? We need to get some nobles and some clergy members to just agree to pay more taxes. And if they do, they can go off and carry the message, much like the intendants that Cardinal Richelieu set up in the 1600s. They can go off and be like, look, for our country to survive, we must pay more in taxes, and maybe we can carry the message forward. Well, when Cologne called this assembly, it was known as the Assembly of Notables in 1787, right? And when the Assembly of Notables came up, Cologne had all of these nobles and all of these clergy members come in to sit down and discuss how they would actually like figure out things that they could pay more taxes on to help survive and help keep the actual France alive, right? Well, the problem is, though, is it failed miserably, right? It failed miserably because many of the nobles actually supported paying more in taxes. Several church members also supported paying more in taxes. They were like, look, the third estate does not need to burden themselves with the entirety of the like actual country. We are willing to do this. But then the other half of them refused, right? So you see what I'm talking about? That revisionism aspect is really important, of the progressive people wanting to try and do something, but conservative people not wanting to do anything, right? So the thing about it, though, is when we're looking at this, and not conservative in the modern day sense, but conservative in the 1800s, 1700s, 18th century ideological sense, right? So the thing about it that you need to understand is that Cologne's attempt at the Assembly Notables failed so miserably that this cartoon began to circulate its way all over Paris. And this right here is the Assembly of Notables on the 22nd of February, 1787. And right here it actually says, "Dear ministers, how would you like to be cooked?" And this is supposed to represent Cologne and the crown, and it's a wolf, and this is all the notables, right? All the nobles and like stuff like that. They're farm birds that are looking at the thing that's going to cook and eat them, right? So literally, this thing failed. It was a massive flop, right? And it led to Cologne being fired, okay? Now, going into it, though, then it led to this guy being hired by massive public demand, okay? Now, this guy's going to be an important story character in the story, okay, of the French Revolution. His name is, write this down, his name is Jacques, Jacqueus, and his last name is Necker, Necker, right? Jacques Necker is actually a Swiss banker, right? He is not even French. He's from Switzerland, right? He is a Swiss banker, and he's a shrewd financial advisor. He's a big fan of cutting expenses, right? He actually was, at one point, the financial advisor up until about 1781. From about like 1774 to 1781, he was the financial advisor that was hired to try and actually cut down a lot of the expenses at Versailles, right? And he did it very, very successfully, saving France a lot of money. But he gets hired again due to massive public demand, because the Third Estate's like, hey, bring back that guy that takes money from rich people. We like him. And they bring Jacques back, and Jacques' first thing he does after he gets hired is he goes up to Louis XVI and he's like, yo, big guy, only way we're going to fix this is by calling the Estates General, right? The Estates General is a meeting that had not met since 1614, right? It had not been called in over 173 years. But what the Estates General is it's basically a representative body only called during times of crisis, right? They hold elections throughout all of France, and they elect these things called deputies that represent each of the three estates, right? And so basically, it's like if the Congress and the Senate all got together, right? And they decided that they were going to vote and decide on how to fix the financial problem problems of France, right? This representative body was represented and elected amongst the people, and it was actually being only called during times of crisis when public opinion was completely necessary. Now, the way it works, though, is you have three separate elected bodies, right? You have one for the first estate or the clergy, you have one for the second estate or the nobles, and then you have one for the third estate or the everybody else, right? And so it's like, since you have all of these different estates, but there's a problem with the way it's set up, y'all. There's only one vote for each estate. So every single time they would actually want to go and vote for something, the first and second estate would outnumber the third one. They couldn't get anything accomplished, right? So the problem is, though, also is, y'all, complaints are flooding into this Estates General that would actually open itself in March of 1789, right? When the actual Estates General is called after a large period of time for due elections to elect these different members and stuff like that, the Estates General comes up and they start to bother each other with the fact that this isn't fair, right? Why is it that these two estates can outnumber the third one and then vote down any of our procedures, right? And the cahiers that are coming in, which are these notebooks of complaints, talking about the price of bread, talking about the taxable inabilities, talking about hunting rights, talking about all kinds of other crazy stuff, are flooding into the Estates General, and these people are being elected based on those complaints, right? So going into the Estates General, things are very, very tumultuous in 1789, and those elected were politically very different, even amongst each estate, right? So we're actually going to pick right up right there, though, when I see you all in class, right? And we'll talk about the Estates General of 1789 and why it was basically doomed to failure since the very, very beginning, all right? So, but we'll talk about that soon. Y'all